Today we're very happy to have, and you'll have to correct my pronunciation, Liviu Kelce. Thank you. Who's an alum of the University of Michigan. He received his PhD in anthropology in 2004. He worked with Catherine Verdery, and he's now a professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Bucharest. So actually, for one, sociology is actually stealing an anthropologist. And he's currently a Fulbright senior researcher at the New School for Social Research. He's an anthropologist and urban sociologist / anthropologist working on urban infrastructures, especially water infrastructures and tap water in New York City and Bucharest. He's working now on a book. He's working on publishing his dissertation, but he has also published in the journal City in the Comparative Studies in Society and History, this very prestigious journal that is published in-house here at the University of Michigan, that's co-authored by interesting people, and we have other members of the editorial board here in the room. In the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, Eurasian Geography and Economics, Anthropology of Work Review, and many others. So we're very glad to have him back at the University of Michigan to talk to us about his work entitled The Housing Question in Eastern Europe Today, Gentrification in Post-Socialist Cities. Thank you very much, and please join me in welcoming you.
Thank you very much. Hi everybody, thank you very much. I'm not only honored to be here, I'm immensely happy to see some people that matter to me, and it just brought up a lot of very nice memory of my most interesting intellectual years so far here at the University of Michigan, and I want to thank Professor Zubritsky and Professor Fehervari and Chris for having me here. My talk will be about cities in Central and Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union, urban inequalities, and more specifically about gentrification. And to talk about gentrification to an American audience is, as one German scholar recently noticed, like bringing sand to the sea. In American academia, but also in mass media and maybe neighborhoods in American cities, more than 50 years of academic debates about the causes and consequences of gentrification made the term almost as familiar as politically charged words like globalization or neoliberalism. To talk about gentrification in Eastern Europe, and especially having a conversation with scholars from the region, is a slightly more delicate issue, both politically and epistemologically. Scholars actively debate if gentrification happens. There are, of course, scholars who use it abundantly, seeing it as an expression of neoliberal austerity and pro-business urbanism in the region. Some scholars, however, are very cautious in using this concept and even deny that there is any gentrification. If they acknowledge it, they quickly mention that there is little displacement happening. There are no local equivalents of the term, and outside academia, the term does not circulate. Moreover, it's the same German scholar, Matthias Bern is his name, notes, quote, in the few cases where gentrification has entered everyday language, it is not very often applied with the same critical undertone typical for Western debates. Recently, urban studies scholars working on Eastern Europe have explored how theories of gentrification may contribute to the understanding of the post-socialist condition, and also what can Western theories learn from the specificities of gentrification in post-socialist cities. Part of that conversation in the last years was a forum organized in Kiev by the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research and the Cities After Transition Research Network, that was last summer, on gentrification on post-socialist cities, where I also participated. In that presentation, I suggested that gentrification is a useful analytic for addressing important questions about the right to the city, the shrinking of affordable housing, and urban inequalities in the capital cities and also second-tier cities of Eastern Europe. Indeed, gentrification and real estate more generally have been key to capital formation and capital flows in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, displacing residents and reinventing centrally located neighborhoods, but also have been instrumental in reimagining such cities as international tourist destinations and investment destinations. It also allowed them to position themselves as spaces of Western, if not global, capitalist consumption rather than spaces of socialist production, thus being able to indicate a material rupture with the socialist urban landscape. So what I want to do in this presentation is first outline 7 core findings in this sizable literature. In doing so, I will describe how early, that is late 1940s and the early 1950s, socialist housing policy is actually crucial to understanding contemporary gentrification. The confiscation and redistribution of housing, based on Friedrich Engels' blueprint from his famous book, The Housing Question, is the one thing that sets post-socialist cities apart in the current wave of planetary gentrification. The post-1990 reverse policy of housing restitution and reprivatization in the inner city neighborhoods generated population replacement. I also suggest that studies of gentrification might gain a lot by taking more seriously the issue of displacement. Understanding displacement in the context of post-socialist Eastern Europe is a political issue as much as it is a methodological one. The presentation will not be country-specific, rather it draws on existing studies of urban change from several cities of Eastern Europe, the former Soviet Union, but also the former German Democratic Republic. And it also, and I'm sorry for the anthropology people, is not also going to be extremely anthropological. I have kind of this like bipolar disciplinary identity. Sometimes I engage work produced by anthropologists and that kind of literature, and other times urban studies literature that falls in the second category. Just
you need to switch screens.
Yeah.
That's
all right. Perfect. So let me briefly go over some core facts about gentrification in cities of Eastern Europe. One common theme is that gentrification has traveled along with post-socialist reform, whatever that means, and capital, reversing the socialist era disinvestment patterns in inner cities. One study, for instance, describes that gentrification occurred first in Moscow, then in the major cities of Eastern Europe such as Prague or Budapest. Then, as reform picked up in ever more places, young people with fewer children started having access to mortgage, replacing elderly households and reurbanizing the relatively neglected inner city quarters, as younger people prefer them to suburbs. Another finding is that the high housing ownership rate in the cities of the region has slowed down gentrification. Home ownership is known to empower residents who own apartments in gentrifying neighborhoods. Even if prices rise, homeowners enjoy a secure position. With their high home ownership rate, post-socialist cities are worlds apart from the hotbeds of gentrification such as New York or San Francisco, where 2/3 of the residents live in rentals. The situation for renters, on the other hand, in post-socialist cities is probably worse, since unlike New York City or San Francisco, there are no rent boards to monitor evictions, regulate rent levels, and regulate somehow the market. Cities in Germany are an exception in that respect. Another theme is that gentrification in the former socialist cities, as its capacity for displacement, is somehow soft. Zoltán Kovács and Reinhard Wissner, two Hungarian, respectively German geographers, suggest that, quote, radical displacement of the population could not evolve. This is soft gentrification or controlled gentrification, end of quote, going as far as to argue that in Budapest, quote, a healthy social mix will probably persist in the inner city in the future, end of quote. Also, several studies maintain that gentrification in post-socialist cities is not revanchist. As I'll argue below, the overall narrative of softness and non-revanchism needs to be nuanced. There is also wide agreement that gentrification in post-socialist cities is not a simple reenactment of gentrification in cities in the United Kingdom or US, but depends heavily on national, urban, and infra-urban contexts. Many factors shape gentrification, but they are not unique to post-socialist cities in any way. They range from different models of urban governance and planning autonomy, such as in Budapest, to conservation and heritage practices in Vilnius or St. Petersburg, population decline and second demographic transition in Leipzig, housing property transfers, and geographies of educational opportunities all over the region. Just like gentrification in New York City and London, for instance, is different, post-socialist cities are themselves internally different as a group and externally from the usual suspect cities of gentrification research due to local accumulation processes, institutional landscapes, social relations, and political struggles. Like in many cities in different parts of the world, gentrifiers are a diverse group. No specific group, let's say yuppies, dominate the process, reflecting different dynamics of post-socialist change. Gentrifiers include, among others, diasporic populations in Tbilisi, Bohemians in Budapest, student and transient urbanites in Uch and Brno, singles, cohabitation, childless couples, and fletchers in Gdańsk, Leipzig, Ljubljana, and tenants, ex-tenants turned owners and speculators in Bucharest. Another aspect is that we have virtually every kind of gentrification and ification reported in other parts of the world. The literature on post-socialist city mentions studentification in Budapest, Leipzig and Ljubljana, super gentrification in Tbilisi or Moscow, new build gentrification in Uch, Budapest, Leipzig and Bucharest, state-led gentrification in Berlin, urban renewal and dispersal of poverty in Budapest, rural gentrification through metropolization and suburbanization, touristic gentrification in cities as varied as Prague, Krakow, Tallinn or Riga, as well as provincial gentrification in Veszprém, Uch or Leipzig. Gay district formation is probably the only absence. Commercialization of inner city neighborhoods has been particularly visible. As one scholar noted, quote, the displacement of residents from central zones through the conversion of dwellings to commercial purposes, primarily for retail and offices, is a universal phenomenon spreading throughout Central and East European cities after 1989, end of quote. But all of the above are not unique to post-socialist Eastern Europe or indeed cities of the Global East in any way. The one feature specific to post-socialist cities are the linkages between the late 1940s and early 1950s housing nationalization, the post-1990 denationalization, displacement and gentrification. Such linkages are significant and unique to post-socialist cities, as nowhere else in the world gentrification flourished where housing nationalization happened. In the housing question, Friedrich Engels held the view that bourgeois housing had to be expropriated and handed over to the working classes. In other words, housing inequalities were a distribution problem more than anything else. After 1990, quartering the workers, as he put it, in bourgeois apartments of the inner city lost any public support. What we are talking about when we talk about post-socialist gentrification is the historical cycle of recommodification of inner city housing, previously decommodified through the revolutionary Soviet projects. Evicting Engels' ideas from ex-socialist cities created fertile grounds for gentrification, whose speed depended on the technical nature of restitution and privatization. The scope, nature, and speed of restitution and the bargaining power of tenants produced different outcomes. In countries with substantial restitution policies, such as Germany, the Czech Republic, Estonia, and lately Romania, gentrification proceeded faster than in countries where restitution was more limited in scope, such as Bulgaria. Similarly, massive restitution of an entire building, as opposed to targeted restitution of or privatization of apartment, led to more rapid commercialization and gentrification, as one may notice comparing Prague to Budapest. The existing literature produced in-depth knowledge about the reinvestment of capital, the social upgrading of locale by high-income groups, and the landscape change. One outstanding gap is displacement. With a few notable exceptions, scholars of gentrification in Eastern Europe have troubles getting around the issue of gentrification-induced displacement. They have active disagreement if the population change in inner city neighborhoods is involuntary displacement or some kind of natural population replacement. A close reading of the existing study indicates that there are two paradigms for locating and conceptualizing this displacement. First, there is what I call the anti-communist interpretation of post-socialist gentrification. This meta-narrative holds that the inner city suffered the fall from grace when Soviet regimes rose to power, as the socialist states nationalized housing, settled in the lower classes, the gypsies and the Russians, and disinvested in them due to massive high-rise construction of the 1960s, 70s and 80s. Thus, by the early 1990s, as post-socialist inner cities were full of residents, they lagged behind their natural function of consumption and entertainment of their Western counterparts. Moreover, some of these residents should not have been there to begin with, as they were too ethnic, too poor, or too old. Thus, the transition from inner city housing to commercialization was normal, as population desired to return to Europe, including in urbanism. Upon this return to pre-communist and Western normality, restitution, revitalization, and possibly displacement emerged, but according to several studies, this is unproblematic, as the post-1899 changes were about market principles, among other things, in land and housing. Generally, such studies are very cautious in using the concept of gentrification, policing its usage, and facing, in a way, a naming frontier. This interpretation has valid elements, for sure. It is, however, relatively uncritical about housing restitution. Just like nationalization, housing restitution was not simply a technocratic project, but also a deeply political one dominated by abuse, power, and privilege. As one geographer, Oleg Golubchikov, points out, quote, denouncing and delegitimizing the practices of state socialism as an unnatural experiment, national and urban regimes of post-socialist transition can only legitimize their push of neoliberalization and austerity politics, end of quote. One study of Berlin, for instance, describes that housing restitution fueled a speculative bubble, whose actors were international investment funds instead of old dynasties of craftsmen and traders. Take, for instance, the Czech geographers Ludek Sikora widely circulate the concept of functional gap, that is the suboptimal usage of commercial and residential space in central neighborhoods in Prague. Sikora exemplifies it with the replacement of the clubrooms of the former Socialist Union of Youth with new offices. But restituted buildings, in addition to the defunct communist political organizations, have also hosted nurseries, kindergartens, primary schools, secondary schools, high schools, hospitals, asylum for the insane, orphanages, artist workshops, craftsmen's workshop, university buildings, and other state institutions. When restituted, they too were deemed to have an inefficient utilization of space and were evicted. Sikora also mentioned the replacement of ordinary shops by luxury services, a process that often triggers emotions among residents of gentrifying neighborhoods in the usual suspect cities of gentrification. When it comes to housing, it is even more complicated to determine efficient utilization. The entire meta-narrative of the return to Europe of ex-socialist cities, as one famous sociologist, Irgin Musil, put it, the concept of urban rectification, relies on a hydraulic metaphor that lends credibility to the idea that one may excavate the pre-socialist city by simply erasing or reversing the changes of the socialist period. Against that background, one may outline a new leftist interpretation of post-socialist gentrification. Some studies hold that changes in the inner city reflect processes happening in the global present rather than the mutant socialist past. Displacement is not only present, but it may be traced. The naming of gentrification is more frequent and the definitions of gentrification are broader. Gentrification was bound to happen sooner or later since there have been deepening social inequalities in cities and increased commodification of housing. Building on this second interpretation, I want to discuss in some detail specific instances of displacement. We have more systematic data for state-led and new-built gentrification projects in Prenzlauer Berg in Berlin, Ferencváros and Corvin Promenade project in District 8 in Budapest, Ostojenka neighborhood in Moscow, and the Castle area in Veszprém. Such episodes, gentrification episodes, are spatially concentrated, quick, and relatively visible in the media and gentrification research. They might be called fast gentrification. Let me give briefly 3 examples from Budapest, Moscow, and Veszprém. One study describes that in Budapest, 1,000 dwellings have been demolished between 1990 and 2004, so that low status classes were replaced by younger and higher status classes with better financial background and more education. The mixed development project of Middle Ferencváros and the Corvin Promenade project displaced, according to one study, quote, the gypsy ghetto by demolishing old buildings and by adding buildings for the highly skilled young urban population, end of quote. Some of that population was dispersed into other districts of Budapest or even beyond the city boundaries. Outside those pockets, this study hold, there was little displacement. Take, for instance, the neighborhood of Ostojenka in Moscow, which lays right next to Kremlin and whose changes have been described in quite some detail. Long left to decay because of planned demolition for the never-built palace of the Soviets, starting early 1990s, it went through apartment by apartment, to house by house, and then to block by block elite housing reconstruction. And you have here like an advertisement for an apartment in New York Times for more than apartments, luxury apartments going in New York City. I mean, I haven't heard of an $88 million apartment in New York. I heard of 40, but not 88.
You mean the one that the oligarch bought for his daughter?
Probably one of those, yeah. Michael Heller, a former University of Michigan law scholar writing about real estate dealers seeking to bundle dispersed property rights of tenants living in communal apartments in that area, describes how, quote, some property bundlers achieve conversion quickly by intimidating or murdering recalcitrant tenants, end of quote. Citing reports of the early 1990s, he holds that, quote, an unintended consequence of privatization of communal housing has been the creation of a group of Comulcas tenants who are particularly vulnerable to predatory private property bundlers, end of quote. Between 1992 and 2004, out of the 3,725 people, that is about 1,600 tenant families living in the district, the government and real estate actors resettled about a third, while another half of the families relocated voluntarily, whatever that means, by swapping their rooms for apartments elsewhere. By 2005, there were only 400 people left. That is about 200 families out of almost 4,000. Perhaps the strongest case study that we have so far on displacement induced by fast gentrification is Veszprém. The state supported touristification project of Yokai Street, located near the castle, led to the displacement of 235 Roma gypsy families. In the late 1990s, instead of social rehabilitation, the administration offered lease buyouts to the families and sold apartments to professionals, owner-occupiers, and landlord developers, i.e. people who had access to credit from banks. These lease buyouts and the relocation were not imagined as a social welfare problem, but rather as a cost to the project. As the authors of the study, Erika Nagy and Judy Timar, two Hungarian geographers, astutely observe, interpreting housing as an asset rather than a right was, quote, an unmistakable product of post-socialist transition, a combination of criticism leveled at the practice of the former paternalistic state and an eulogy of the new social order. End of quote. The strength of the study derives from its ability to follow the displaced over a longer period of time. Only 4 displaced families managed to get bank loans to round up the relocation money in order to purchase apartments elsewhere. The rest found accommodation in one village outside Vesprem, only to return to an isolated housing estate, hoping to access better employment opportunities and better welfare benefits. Nagy and Timar concluded the displacement has only recreated the inner city conditions elsewhere. A similar but even faster removal of the poor, mostly Roma families, happened in 2007 in the historical district of Bucharest. Dozens of families and their belongings were loaded overnight by the riot police into trucks and moved elsewhere, not in Bucharest, but outside of it in open agricultural fields. Barrico modification and displacement did not only happen in targeted areas of intervention. Restitution has also had a capillary nature, often limited to 1 or 2 apartments in a building here and there. Accordingly, some displacement has had a piecemeal spatial evolution, which did not attract much attention. It is probably no news if 1 or 2 families are evicted here and there, now and then, even though constantly, whereas the planned removal of Hrushchevska buildings affecting 1.5 million people in Moscow make instant news. Thus, we also have what might be called slow gentrification, i.e. restitution-induced displacement that is inconspicuous to the media, piecemeal, capillary, and gradual. I use the adjective slow, not only in its temporal sense, though that may be the case as well, but rather in Rob Nixon's sense of slow violence. Nixon understands slow violence as violence that is invisible to the media and the public and unfolds slowly, such as like pollution or like radiation, stuff like that. Let me mention some less visible and more geographically dispersed experience that came along with the slow dispersed gentrification. For some tenants in Polish cities, according to one study, quote, reprivatization processes led to the eviction of tenants living on property of this kind, in some cases resulting in homelessness. Higher rents in reprivatized housing set off gentrification and growing tenant indebtedness. And there were also a growing number of unoccupied buildings, either waiting for resolution of ownership status or left vacant for speculative purposes. The indebted and unwanted tenants in reprivatized property were exposed to serious harassment, severely aggravating living situations by cutting off of electricity and water, causing flooding or fires in the property, and making threats. End of quote. Similar harassment by landlords of restituted housing has been reported in Bucharest, but also in Prague, where, according to another study, quote, some of the new post-privatization restitution landlords use various dubious tactics to evict low-income and elderly population in order to replace them with higher-income tenants and more profitable functions. End of quote. Also in Prague, for instance, between 1991 and 1998, rent ceilings increased 5 times in real terms. In Ostojenka, owners of rooms in Komunalki apartments who resisted compensations faced violence, cut-off of utilities, implants of ex-prisoners and homeless people, and the purposeful damaging of buildings so as to make them suitable for emergency evictions. In Bucharest, there are credible reports of racism, disrespect, and chronic deferral of social housing requests or purchases by low-income tenants evicted from restituted housing. People affected by the transportation-related urban renewal project Berzi Buzești in Bucharest, a major project, have either doubled up with relatives or moved outside of Bucharest for good to the satellite city of Buftea, some 30 kilometers away. Tenants evicted from restituted housing also in Bucharest since the early 2000s have built makeshift shelters such as this that you can see here on the sidewalks in front of their former housing. As of 2009-2010, on the sidewalks of Bucharest, of inner city Bucharest, there were 10 such constructions. 6 had protest inscriptions, and the architects who did the study even created a typology of the architecture of such shelters, from storage to house to wagon, so interesting stuff. Some of the low-income tenant families who left the restituted inner-city housing have moved to housing estates built during socialism. Some others had to leave the city altogether. Analyzing the poor quarters of inner-city Budapest, Hungarian sociologist János Ladányi mentions that, quote, because of the declining living standards, the rise of rents and price of utilities, large groups of poor people have decided to move from metropolitan areas to nearby settlements in the countryside. Adrian de Wancă, who sits right there, an anthropologist studying railroad workers in Bucharest, reports that some of them, but also the badly paid personnel of security firms, the largest employment sector in Bucharest with no less than 100,000 employees, are not able to pay rent and live 1 or 2 hours away by train from the capital city. A famous eviction case in Bucharest occurred in 2014 in one centrally located street. The building of Vulturilor Street number 50, housing 20 families, that is about 100 persons, had been restituted in 2002. Anticipating evictions, the family petitioned the municipal government for social housing for 12 years. Meanwhile, the building changed hands to a Norwegian investor. Right after the eviction, the investor demolished the building, a frequent strategy among real estate investors in Bucharest. Some mothers and children accepted the local government's offer to move to shelters for abused women, although obviously it was not their husbands that abused them, while their husbands and fathers ended up in homeless shelters for men. Some families remained in their improvised sidewalks shelters for almost 2 years. Yet other tenants in Bucharest, evicted from nationalized housing, occupy illegally other emptied buildings, which are waiting demolition. Such squatters move elsewhere as they are chased away because the buildings are demolished or resold. Such evictions have been the topic of a 2017 documentary called It Started Raining by the University of Sheffield geographer Michele Lancione. And I just want to show you a 1-minute clip, if that's okay.
Aici o să rămânem, ori murim, ori trăim. Cât o să rezistăm, atâta rezistăm, pentru că nu avem unde să ne ducem.
Noi am decis că stăm în stradă, noi decidem dacă stăm în stradă. Am căutat lemne și ne-am ajutat reciproc. Fiecare ne-am ajutat unul pe celălalt, ca să spun așa.
Totdeauna între WC-uri, da. Și fac duș.
Bucureștiul generează probabil în jur de 800-1000 de persoane evacuate pe an.
Unde sunt toți cei care ar trebui să ne apere? Să ne ofere a copiilor noștri un adăpost? V-ați bătut joc de noi? Bună seara, domnule Goi!
Bună seara, bună seara! Ce faceți dumneavoastră?
Oare ce-ar fi dacă într-o zi te-ai trezi fără să fii cum știi?
I'm advertising this because I'm also in that movie, so it's okay. The situation was made worse in such cases by a general laissez-faire approach to planning, in the sense that as one scholar noticed, the general consensus of the direction in which cities should develop was complemented by spontaneous notions of planning. Housing restitution and the displacement that it entailed overlapped with the rapid dismantling of the free prefab high-rise constructions programs in the early 1990s. As one scholar notes, quote, once unleashed, the forces of market are difficult to restrain, especially in the neoliberal political context characterizing the post-socialist countries of Eastern Europe. End of quote. One may wonder if and what kind of resistance emerged to counter such gentrification forces. In a way, we have a boring protestless gentrification in post-socialist cities. With the exception of Berlin and possibly other cities in former GDR, there is nothing comparable to the riots of Tompkins Square Park in New York City in the late 1980s, the slashing of the tires of Google and LinkedIn company buses in San Francisco, the dynamism of neighborhood associations in large cities in the US. Or, and this is my favorite, the devastation by an angry mob of the serial killer bar on Brick Lane in East London a few years ago. Basically, this bar brings cereals from all over the world and sells them for like £5 a bowl. And it was devastated by these people right here. They painted stuff, and it was in the Guardian. We also know little of anti-eviction activism, although, as the same German scholar notes, quote, it might easily be the case that we have just not heard about resistance because reports are not made in English or because local epistemologists just do not acknowledge acts of resistance as anti-gentrification. Direct resistance to gentrification and displacement is known to have taken place in Prenzlauer Berg, Berlin, in the early 1990s, where the coalition Wir bleiben alle, We All Stay, mobilized some 20,000 participants protesting rent increase. According to one scholar and activist, the protests were dismissed by the media as being too Eastern to be taken seriously. In Bucharest, politically active theater artists engaged the community of Rahova-Uranus area, adjacent to the Romanian parliament, with some staggering 150 houses restituted to a single claimant allegedly living in France. The families are steadily evicted, and the artists were able to make residents aware and assist them in getting some rights. More individualized forms of radical protest occurred in Bucharest, where some tenants evicted from nationalized housing went on hunger strikes. Other forms of protests were more indirect and less radical. We know, for instance, that residents of inner city Prague oppose alcohol tourism and Segway tours and voice heritage conservation and quality of life concerns in the central touristified areas of Prague. Resistance to gentrification in the post-socialist high-rise neighborhoods in Bulgaria and Romania is an interesting case, and this is my kind of last example. Densification is the construction of new buildings on the green spaces populated by benches, playgrounds and gazebos lying between the existing buildings, and based on the unfortunate interpretation of restitution legislation. Densification may be regarded as a form of new build gentrification, since such new buildings attract people who otherwise would have fallen for the suburbs, and they generate additional commercial spaces at their ground floor. According to some urbanists, this pattern of development has provoked a strong reaction by the local residents, as well as the sympathy of city officials, who, at least in Sofia, pressed for changes in the legislation. Another contentious aspect is to what extent gentrification is revanchist. And revanchism in the context of gentrification, you know, is like this idea that non-middle classes have taken over the city. It came out of New York. It references the things that happened after the Paris Commune, when the reactionary government that came after the defeat of the 8-month protests thought to generate order on the streets. So is this like Rudolph Giuliani kind of approach to order? Based on data gathered in Tbilisi, some geographers found that rather than quote, rather than representing a revanchist return to the city of the middle classes, new built apartments in Tbilisi appear largely to accommodate demographic growth and deposited diaspora capital, end of quote. On the other hand, geographers working in Ostojenka and describe that, quote, the violence involved in the process of displacement is reminiscent of Neil Smith's revanchist city applied to him in the US context, end of quote. Similarly, a study of crime perceptions in inner city of Prague found that displacement, quote, displacement, prohibition of alcohol consumption in public spaces, urban design prevention, surveillance, and police patrols can be interpreted as a manifestation of neoliberal urban governance and revanchist urbanism, end of quote. To be sure, no city in Eastern Europe comes nearly close to the 800,000 households dislocated by gentrification and urban renewal in Shanghai over a period of 10 years, a situation that is even more drastic than what happens in the revanchist city scene in the US. However, as we know from other cities, gentrification is often accompanied by the use of police forces to suppress resistance, the co-optation of the opposition, and the imposition of dominant ideologies on the subordinate classes, as one urban scholar noted. As a rule, for instance, in Bucharest, the municipal administration does not send in the social services, but rather the riot police to make sure that the evicted tenants do not return to their former apartments. In such instances, waste collector services are sent in to confiscate their belongings, and the child services are sent in to forcibly remove children from their families if they sleep on the sidewalk after evictions. The playgrounds are locked overnight in order to prevent the homeless from finding a place to sleep, similar to the new urban design prevention of the homeless in Prague's public spaces, for instance, reducing the number of benches available in squares, in plazas. In Bucharest, and this is not an isolated case in Romanian cities, applicants holding a PhD diploma get five times more points towards social housing eligibility compared to a family with children, as many local administrations fantasize that Silicon Valleys will spring up all over the country. So, to sum up, the examples described above suggest that gentrification takes place and does cause displacement that often goes underreported. As one famous scholar of gentrification noted and warned us, L.V. Wiley is his name, at the very least, quote, we have the responsibility to highlight what is missing, end of quote. We might gain critical data by talking to activists, homeless shelters, street-level bureaucrats and police, school principals, and the working poor who live outside cities, in addition to what we learn from real estate agents and incoming households. The umbrella concept of gentrification, which obviously has its own problems, and I'm not even going to touch that, is an excellent window onto capital, community, suffering, and privilege in post-socialist cities. Its usefulness lays in the capacity to ask questions about the right to the city, displacement, and the shrinking of affordable housing. It gives us an indication of who the winners and the losers of urban planning are, and how social classes are specialized and reconstructed in urban Eastern Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for this very fascinating talk. I know we have about half an hour for Q&A. I think you can let you actually hold on. Thank you.
If you can help me with the A.
Huh?
Liviu, thank you for an amazing talk. Can you come give this lecture to my class tomorrow?
Sure.
I know that you're doing Airbnb in New York City, and Airbnb is a new sort of player on the landscape, and I wondered if you could say something about what you know. I know in Budapest it's happening very quickly, and it's doing the work of gentrification that somehow bypasses a lot of the other things that slowed it down.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting process, and I know of scholars who work on that, on Airbnb and gentrification, and there are scholars at the University of Amsterdam who look at how wealth is being liquefied and circulated, housing wealth. What I don't know much about, I didn't really pick up in Romania, for instance, that I know better. And the little I've seen were apartments that were already kind of apart hotels, I think it's called. This kind of flexible mixed kind of thing, and they don't cost more than a hotel would cost, and the little I know is that they were already emptied out of tenants. So that was in a way based on removal of these long-term tenants. The work was already done by the restitution legislation, at least in Bucharest. But no, that's a great research topic. Kelly.
Very good. Welcome back.
Thank you.
I wondered if there have been any coalition building that might help address this. I'm thinking in Washington, D.C., there's a group called the Blue-Green Alliance, where blue is representing labor and green environmentalism, and this would be a perfect case where two sets of converging interests would be in preventing more of this, so that's to keep more green spaces while making labor.
Yeah, I mean, one would expect that, would find such kind of coalition building. And I know of Germany, a little bit of Berlin. There has been some of that in the early 1990s, but not so much after that. So they had a quick start with protests and things like that, and actually they stopped rent increase a little bit. On the other hand, I think many times protests in Eastern Europe are looked upon as a kind of like socialist era thing. People had too much, they want too much equality. It's like a thing of the past. You don't protest for social rights. You are pretty quickly located in the kind of like nostalgic camp. So there is a kind of slow pickup. For instance, I know that now in Bucharest, the guy who made the documentary and a great scholar from University of California, Santa Barbara, Erin McElroy, who's doing great stuff in San Francisco. She has been working for 10 years in organizing protests, and she has a great portal anti-eviction mapping project that actually puts a face on the housing estate, real estate capital. It's not just like a generic notion, but it is this company that has 4,000 apartments, and it does that. And it has interviews with tenants and people like that. And she's organizing something in Bucharest together with local activists and people like that. But how much you can push things with this, I don't know. I mean, I think it's a regulatory process, and like the administration is not thinking through. I mean, they're thinking to increase the real estate taxes in order to push elderly people out. I mean, that's the kind of urban planning, inclusive urban planning that they do. But hopefully, yeah, at some point that will happen.
If I can follow up, because I think that the Blue Green Alliance's strategy is lobbying legislatures, and I guess I wonder, in this case, you say that they're not interested. But regulation and advocacy work with, for instance, the Convention on Social and what's the rest of that? Convention on Social, Economic, and political rights, I guess. No, cultural rights, and Constitution amendments, things of that nature. I mean, there is a multi-party opportunity to get other political parties to make these sort of centerpieces of their campaigns. And elderly do have the vote, right?
Yep.
But I mean, to piggyback on this, and there's no populist movement that's kind of really taking that issue. Like in
Well,
Poland, for example,
yeah.
I mean, this is what the Law and Justice parties is,
Yeah.
you know, all the forgotten people from the, the transition, and they get vote.
Yeah, I mean, like Slavoj Žižek is saying, the irony is that the leftist parties shy away from any kind of agenda related to this, while it is the populists who can voice and have a comfortable identity taking up such claims. And I heard of Poland and some of the kind of housing issues that the current coalition tries to kind of tackle it, but I don't know of other cases. For sure, not in Romania. Like there is no kind of voice to take over these people's plea. But who knows? I mean, it may happen.
Populism may
Yeah.
reach Romania.
Adi, you.
Thank you very much. Excellent talk. I know we share an interest in infrastructural fetishism, and I was wondering whether you would consider this massive changes in housing and the socio-demographic of housing also in relationship to the sort of East European fetishism for infrastructure. I'm especially referring to road building. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about development projects that involve demolitions in order to make way for roads accommodating cars. But I'm also thinking about infrastructure access as a way to either bring in certain types of population or to push them out.
Mm-hmm.
Have you encountered any of these issues throughout your research?
I haven't seen research done about that in other cities of Eastern Europe. I know just like some anecdotal evidence from Bucharest, like gentrification and like the kind of raise of rents and the value of houses would happen where they, for instance, replace the tram lines and like they replace the water mains and stuff like that. Obviously, at least in some parts of Europe, like car number explosion, it's a huge thing, and unlike landscapes of gentrification that are used pedestrian kind of landscapes, these get combined into this obsession with driving from your house 5 meters away every time you have a chance. So, I mean, for instance, in Bucharest there are 1.8 million people and there are 1.5 million cars. That is registered car, let alone the people who come from the satellite area. So it's one, and I think in your city with 8 million people is like 1.3 million cars, or it was a few years ago. So it's that kind of dynamic that obviously creates, I mean, people would value any time a parking lot over a social housing building. They would have no problem, like the people whose voice matters to local administration.
Could you say more? Could you say more about taxation and markets in relation to this? So you talked about various kinds of processes. So I'm just thinking about people they're thinking about the dynamics and how they might contrast. And is it how, like sort of weighting the relative factors? Like there's restitution, then there's a kind of mafia, like that they're driving people out of buildings. How does that compare with the kind of the gentrification that takes place that are more along dynamics of here, where the rent goes up so much, people have to move out because they can't afford it, or else the price of their apartment is so big that they decide to sell it and move somewhere else. So I don't want to get into voluntary versus involuntary, but what's the relative weight of this sort of restitution and mafia versus these other kinds of processes that are more market driven?
Right. I can say a few things about real estate taxing in Bucharest, and it doesn't matter if you have one apartment or 60 additional apartments, the taxation doesn't go up. So it's still taxed the same as you are like a normal homeowner. So that created a lot of incentives for people to demolish inner city housing, sometimes with tenants left over from socialist era, whatever, and then build abnormally high for that kind of low-rise neighborhoods buildings. So you would have like 1 or 2 stories high building, and then because of many things, including corruption, lately we find they get building permits that allow them to build, for instance, 4 stories high legally building, on the top of which they build another 2 level of attic, what goes as attic, but it's only like a line of paint building on the building, that's the attic. And on top of that, they might build something 1 or 2 levels because they only get a fine of like, I don't know, $3,000-$5,000, and the apartment sells for like hundreds of thousands of dollars. So it's that kind of speculative real estate. Like the notions of urban planning are really weak and pro-business. Like cities, at least in Romania, lost some of the ability and the power to actually compose and generate cities. That's passed over to real estate people. So, yeah.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I just wanted you to say more about taxes, because I know in Hungary property taxes were really hard to pass. So here, everything's on property taxes.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, in the sense that it affects this kind of dynamics. I think the property taxes, I can speak for Bucharest, they're not high by any chance. They don't go up and down. They don't vary. It's not like each year the city comes and takes pictures and then decides how much that house values. It's not on a kind of market-based rate. It's a flat. It used to be flat across the board. It didn't matter if you lived in the socialist high-rise estates or you lived in the very downtown of Bucharest. That changed in mid-2000s, but they created 4 taxation areas, but the differences are tiny. I mean, they're just like, you can, it's not like something that prohibits you from having a building in a centrally located. So I don't think taxation directly affects the kind of places where people settle. Yeah.
I was wondering if you did some spatial analysis too, to see how the gentrification process might be impacted differently in Bucharest, that I think is very widespread, versus, Warsaw or Prague,
yeah,
or other that are more concentrated.
Yeah.
Because, for example, in Detroit, gentrification is happening differently than in other places, like Pittsburgh, for example, that's because of density of population and the spread of the urban. So I was wondering if you considered that in your comparative.
Yeah, I mean, there are such studies done. There is one in Poland that I've seen, like taking census tracts and comparing the 2011-12 census with the 10 years earlier one. And one shocking thing is the amount of college-educated people that left the cities. I mean, it's like a substantial drop in number of working class high school educated or lower across the city, and that the same goes for Bucharest. Just like the non-college educated people are less relative to their total number, and this is particularly visible in high prestige neighborhoods. This kind of like in Bucharest, it's almost half, 50% of the population in centrally located neighborhoods, college educated, and It used to be 15, 14 in the early 1990s. So yeah, I think some people just like leave the city. Like we know that is happening in Budapest. Like there are studies about that by sociologists who trace these people where they go. Yeah, so it's a double thing. It's across the board for the entire city, and in central neighborhoods even more intense.
Anyone else? Last call. No? Thank you so much for this great talk.
Thank you very much.
We look forward to the book.